This lecture addresses the very important Neolithic site of Catal Hoyuk in south central uh, Turkey. Um, this is a very important site that I had the opportunity to even participate on in its more recent excavations. It's not, typical. But it has important pieces of art that you should see. Now, remember, uh, we're dealing with the spread of farming, and in the case for Europe, it is coming from the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East, and so you can see there's that red zone, and then it goes orange and lighter and lighter. We already talked about Stonehenge, which was in England, and that's sort of at the end of the Neolithic, and the Neolithic is later there than it is in the Middle East. So remember, Neolithic means, when you have Neolithic, what we're saying is farming begins, and if farming doesn't begin, we don't consider it that. And it seems to have spread, as I said in the last class, from what's called demic diffusion, and that is the spread of the people themselves, not just the idea of farming. And studies of DNA and alleles have proven that Europeans are a distant descendant of the people here. So we're moving to an earlier site now, back to the lower right, and this is a big mound. Hoyuk is simply Turkish for tell or mound, namely an anthropogenic mound. In other words, this mound in the lower left, you see it sticking up there, would not exist if humans hadn't been there. And it's primarily just levels and levels of mud brick architecture, also mixed in with some artwork. And you can see the mud brick architecture here. They actually, even if you look real close, you can even see the layers of the bricks. They're pretty large. They're bigger than modern bricks. They're the size of a laptop, and it still preserves to this very day. And we see a whole bunch of houses in this settlement. Here's another plan of just how these houses were arranged, and we can see that they're agglutinative. That is to say, houses are added on as they go along. There's a lot of party walls, but you leave a court open. But as we'll see, everything, all the houses were adjacent to one another. Now, here I'll come back to that concept in 1 second. Here are the modern the roof of the more recent excavations. There were some done in the 60s by James Mellart, and then more recently by Ian Hodder. And you can see just how extensive this site is. But it's important to have this roof over it because the rain will wash away the mud brick. Indeed, when I worked there with the later excavations, some of the structures from the early excavations were left exposed to deteriorate. Now, here is a plan of the site, or part of the site, and these red lines indicate what they think to be separate households. One thing this map does not have, or a plan does not have, is the holes in the roof, because they entered via the roof. And so one of the benefits of having all these houses connected is that you just walked over roofs and then descended into where you live or whatever house you were going to visit. And we see here just some of the once again, the mud brick architecture, what we're dealing with here. And it's pretty impressive. It's impressive that it still stands to this very day. Now, here's another shot of the site. Once again, you can see that mound. Where when it's sort of the bottom right of the mound, you see those trenches there. That's from the old excavation. The newer excavation have exposed much. But this is a big mound, right? This mound is about this, not too much smaller than campus. And there's a lot of dirt there, and people lived there for a long time. Um, but it preserves some pretty special things for us that show us sort of the bizarre nature of the people at Catal Hoyuk. And you can see here at the bottom in this reconstruction that's in the museum, the people there was a little hole in the roof, and people could descend down from that with a ladder. And a lot of the houses have uh, this artwork of, first of all, focusing on cattle. And here we see what are called bucrania, or bucranium in the singular. Those are the cattle heads put against the wall there. Um, you know, cattle are worth a lot of money. They had a lot of meat. They had, milk, and apparently were very important to the people of Çatalhöyük. And I guess after the animal died or they slaughtered it or whatever, they took the skull and had it defleshed and hung it on the wall. Um, Also, notice above it another common piece of iconography is it seems to be a woman's with arms and legs completely out. Perhaps that means regenerative sort of nature. But as we'll see, they can be somewhat explicit in their sexuality in their art. Um, well, I'd like to point out also in this reconstruction, notice the pottery laying around the floor. Because don't forget, pottery starts with the Neolithic, because hunter-gatherers don't use pots. You can't carry them because they're nomadic. Only when you become sedentary do you start to produce these. And they're always a sign of excellent pyrotechnics. You have to have very high temperatures in order to fire a pot. So they are very, very impressive. Now here's a reconstruction of a house here with this bucranium. What I want to point out is that design on the bottom, on the two walls on the left, and those are textile designs. And we can see a painted one on the bottom here. Oh, I should add, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you this before. Yeah, these walls are covered over with white plaster and then painted upon. And when you excavate there, you realize that they put on plaster coverings, almost annually, so they were changing all the time. And they would then, sorry, I lost my screen there for a moment. Um, they whitewash these walls and would paint over, and they seem to whitewash them annually. So we just have the latest of them. But it's also just solid evidence that of the deforestation that farmers do and continue to do this very day. Right, we see it in the Amazon now, but this was going on in the Middle East, much, much, much earlier. Indeed, many people have some people have argued that the reason is so like a desert in parts of it is because it's just been it's had all the trees cut down and it's been overexploited. But remember, they have wood, so they can build houses. They can use it as fuel, and make tools, etc., etc. So that's a big advance here. Again, now back to our obsidian. There's also a lot of good obsidian at Hassan, and here we see a core, and you can see those little scars going top to bottom there. You would have struck this piece on the top right, and if you're good at this in directing the percussion, you can take off nice, nice, nice thin blades. This is probably once again about the size of my hand, and it produces these blades. Obsidian's one of the sharpest things out there. Apparently, eye doctors still use it when they have to have a little bit of surgery on the eyeball itself. The edge breaks down just to molecular structures. That's how thin it gets. So it's really good for cutting. The problem is it's very brittle, and so you have to make a lot of these things, and you'll go through them a lot. Especially if it's something like a sickle blade, where you have to insert 10 or 15 of these on the interior of the crescent of the blade in order to cut down grasses or what have you. You'll be going through a lot of these. And as I said in an earlier class, everybody had to know how to make stone tools. As the saying goes, if you didn't, you died. These are what kept people alive. It allowed them to hunt. It allowed them to process food, etc. We also get these obsidian nodules, basically, as we'll see, used for mirrors. Now, what has happened here is that that outside there is the cortex of the obsidian. It's interesting when you see these, and there's no black showing. You'd have no idea that it's obsidian unless you know what you're doing. And it has been somehow sort of cracked in half so smoothly that the whole face is connected and perfect, right? This was not polished because when the flake scar is shinier than any sort of polishing. And so here we see an example of how this could have been used. And what's interesting too is that we start to see artificial ways of looking at ourselves, right? No mirrors yet. The only way you sort of saw what you looked like was staring in the water. We're so used to knowing what we look like. We're always in the mirrors. I mean, look at this. I'm on the screen myself, looking at myself while making this. And we just take it for granted. But imagine, way back when, especially during the Paleolithic, where the only way you can see yourself is if you looked at a stream. The water's rippling. It's not perfect. You're not doing it all the time, and probably not as well kempt as we like. Um, but now they were able, to do this, and so they use that obsidian, and it's an interesting step in sort of self-awareness. And we have evidence that they like to, decorate themselves. For example, with this. Now, this is a stamp. It's about the size of my thumb, and what you would do is you would press it down into ink, and then put it against your body with these types of seals. Later on, we'll see seals used in a different way, but these seals we believe were for body painting, and so they want to decorate their bodies, and so we see incipient signs of that. Now, another interesting thing that happens at Catal Hoyuk, and this is found at several Neolithic sites around the area, are these what are called stereotopicus figurines, or fat lady figurines, and a lot of these are found. And now notice that this one is seated, but naked and missing the head. We'd seen them before. Remember in the Venus of Willendorf from the Paleolithic. We see these, these robust, rotund forms, and as I've said before, this was probably a sign of beauty, because as hunter-gatherers, there wasn't excessive food. And they were walking all the time and moving around all the time. And as I talked about when I discussed carbohydrates in an earlier lecture, they could eat a lot of food, but work it off pretty quick. They were nowhere as sedentary as we are. That's for sure. And if any of you've ever worked at a farm, it's hard work, and eats up every day of the year. But here we see this Paleolithic one, okay? So she's standing, and no facial features, and she's naked, and, large breasts, indicating fertility. Now, one of the great figurines we find at Catal is this lady, but she is seated. Her head has been replaced or fixed, so we're not sure if that had those facial features or not. She sits in, some people argue it's a throne with these animal heads at the, front of the armrests, and we can even see the body of the animal decorated on the side. It's not certain that this is a throne, and the more popular interpretation is that it's a birthing chair, and that is a child coming out at the bottom of her feet, and her stomach is just recently deflated from the birth. We always, imagine, births, when women give birth, they're laying on their backs. But in a lot of societies, that's not the case. Women, there are some places where, women grab onto a branch of a tree, right, and use that to, give birth, or sit in this chair. Now, notice the things around her shoulder. That's argued that those are straps in order to sort of hold her down or hold her steady while she is giving birth. And also pay attention that she is seated. Okay, so we're getting that. We're getting furniture in the architecture. When you're a hunter-gatherer, furniture was virtually non-existent, and now we see it in the Neolithic because people were sedentary. So it is a throne. We don't know. It's not certain, but the regenerative aspect of the figurine is obvious. Fertility and sexuality are being sold here. Now, once again, these rotund forms, were desirable, and they were probably not the typical woman. We can see that in fashion magazines, let's say, where there's a beautiful model on the cover, right? And one of the things is, there's makes them beautiful, is whatever the culture has decided beauty is, but also being exceptional and not being like everybody else, right? If everybody was pretty, nobody would be pretty, right? Because we'd all just be the same. Uh, and these their idea of beauty was a very, very, very rotund woman that they probably didn't encounter that frequently. Here she is from the backside. Those shoulder straps don't come down, so it's not certain about that. But notice that she doesn't. There's no back to it. Now it might be missing. We're not sure, but if there were a back to it that came up, why decorate the buttocks? But in any case, we see this idea that continues on from the Paleolithic, of the idea of large women as beautiful. But now we get things like them being seated or giving birth. And so this is just an addition, some changes because they are sedentary, but they still maintain some of the artistic ideas that the Paleolithic had. We saw that on that wall painting, and we see it here with the figurines. And many of the figurines are quite explicit sexually. I'll show you this one. So you get the idea here. But Catal Hoyuk is an exemplary Neolithic site with this wonderful painting and artwork, and we think something special must be going on there because although we see wall paintings elsewhere, we don't see them in so many of them. Perhaps it's a matter of preservation. We're not certain, but the idea of along with the sedentism and the food producing rather than food procuring, we see artistic ideals change. So with that, we will end the show.